Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, I think we're all right.
We're all right. So, hopefully, all fill up from our lovely lunch. Not going to fall asleep on the back row. So next up, Sir James, over to you.
Thank you. Firstly, apologies about the somewhat warped aspect ratio on this. It's not supposed to be so truncated. I'm not generally this bad at graphic design, so apology about that in advance. Excited to be here, excited to be giving this talk. It's the first time I've given a talk kind of since sort of the start of the pandemic, or at least in person. So really happy to be talking about something that I've just been really passionate about over the last 4 months, which is this project that I've been working on called Terra Draw. So a little bit about me. My name's James. I am a web developer, software engineer. I am currently working at a company called Nearform, which is a JavaScript consultancy, but have previously worked at places like Esri, Ordnance Survey, some startups called like 3D Repo, and my last role, which was at a company called Dent Reality, which I'll come on to in a little bit because it's somewhat the starting point of the kind of story of this project. Outside of work, I am helping out maintaining Turf.js, which I'm sure some of you have probably come across or even used. And I'm also a Google developer expert for web technologies. Kind of want to give a bit of background of like the story of Terra Draw, kind of where it came out of. So historically, I guess throughout my career, I've worked on a lot of web-based mapping applications, and a subset of those have used or have had the use case of needing to draw on a map. So as an example, when I worked at Ordnance Survey, I was working for a company that was looking at taking farmland, turning that, like parceling that up, and then being able to use that as set aside for like CO2 carbon offsetting sequestration program, like carbon sequestration to offset your CO2 emissions. And then, more recently, I was working for a company called Dent Reality, who are building indoor mapping and navigation SDK, mostly for kind of like the retail space. So you could hold up your phone and then it would give you like an AR overview and you could navigate through the store. And as part of my role there, I was responsible for building a map building tool. And that was essentially to allow customers to draw out their stores so that they could be used by the SDK, the mobile app. I spent a lot of time working with web maps and a lot of time thinking about drawing on web maps. And so at Dent Reality, we were using a tool called Mapbox GL Draw. So we were using Mapbox Maps, Mapbox GLJS as the mapping library for the base maps. And then we were using Mapbox GL Draw as the kind of drawing plugin for that application, basically. And I kind of got quite familiar with Mapbox GL Draw and kind of got to understand its strengths and also its weaknesses, and kind of started having some thoughts around like, is there something in this? Like, is there something that could be done better here, or is there like improvements that could be made? Because one of the things I was finding was that, like, for example, I'd raise a pull request to Mapbox GL Draw and it kind of like never really went anywhere. And I was a little bit like frustrated by that whole process. So after I stopped working at Dent Reality in May this year, and took some time out, went to Greece. So this is a picture of Hydra. It's really nice. You should definitely go if you ever get the opportunity. Beautiful island. In Greece, and also to Bulgaria. And I spent a lot of that kind of, I guess, sort of like a break between work, just thinking about that kind of map drawing space and that kind of whole problem space. And started like just looking at the different implementations, obviously Mapbox.gl Draw, and then looking at other kind of alternative like map drawing libraries, also looking at how like they were actually being used. So I have like a few examples to kind of illustrate what I'm talking about in the kind of map drawing problem space. So this is an example. This is Waze. They have a map editor, and that allows you to essentially update geospatial information that they then use in the Waze app for things, you know, obviously it's a traffic app. So you can do things like, I think, update, I don't know, like the speed limit on a road and these kinds of things. I'm not super familiar with it. I haven't actually used it in anger. I've just played with it on their web app. So don't quote me on anything in terms of what it's actually used for. But the point is that you can draw on a map. And in a similar vein, this is, I think, Rightmove. And they have like a search functionality where you can draw out a polygon and you say, I'm only interested in properties that exist within this polygon. And so Zoopla have a very similar piece of functionality on their website. And the last example I've got is from National Geographic. They have like a map making tool where you can kind of go and like a kind of, I guess, somewhat similar to something like ArcGIS Online.
Sorry to interrupt. We've got someone downstairs, a guy Haywood. He says from the British Pilgrim.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Sorry about that. So yeah, National Geographic have this web app for allowing you to kind of build, you know, basic maps with data, and you can draw on it. It's kind of like, I guess, somewhat stripped down version of ArcGIS Online or something along those kind of lines. But yeah, basically, I just wanted to illustrate the kind of problem space that I'm talking about. Drawing on maps is probably the summary. And so yeah, like I was saying, I was looking at implementations, but I was also looking at the actual underpinning libraries as well. So there's a few out there. Like I was saying, so we were using Mapbox.gl Draw, which is obviously tied to using Mapbox.gl JS. And there's another couple which are quite popular in the leaflet space. So Leaflet Draw is one example, and one called Free Draw is another example, again, for Leaflet. Google Maps have kind of like a built-in editing manager, I think they call it, in the actual library. And I think OpenLayers have like a kind of built-in editing kind of tool as well. So there are some other kind of like baked-in kind of map drawing elements to kind of different libraries as well. But these are kind of the main open source kind of separate library ones that I came across. One of the main problems that I came across with these libraries is that they're just, nobody's really touching them. Like they just haven't really been updated in some of them. You know, like there's a file there that's not been touched in like 10 years. You know what I mean? So there's this, and you know, that's kind of sometimes what happens with open source projects. Like people lose interest, or they get bored, or something else happens, or something better comes along, or whatever it might be. So yeah, not knocking it, but just basically saying like this was kind of the impetus for, is there something that we can build that's kind of current and modern and solves all the same kind of problems and maybe more. And that's where I started with Terra Draw, which was, I kind of had this idea of like, well, there's all these map drawing libraries, varying levels of quality, varying levels of how well maintained they are, how up to date they are. And I started thinking about it like more abstractly. I was like, I have this inkling that like you could write a library that could just interact, like could interface with all of these different libraries, and you don't necessarily need to be tied to just Leaflet or just Google Maps or just Mapbox. And I basically started experimenting with that and realized that that was possible. And I'll come on to like kind of how that works in a bit more detail in a few more slides. But yeah, I basically just started. I was like, as soon as I realized it was possible, I got really just invested in trying to like make this thing happen, and spent a lot of Sunday mornings at the coffee shop next to my house, trying to just make this work basically. So I kind of want to give you a bit of a technical overview of Terra Draw, and explain a little bit about the goals and kind of how it works basically, and what the benefits are of that approach. So I knew kind of from the outset that I was like, I had this idea of it just being this cross library, like cross map library tool. So that was one thing that I wanted to happen. Another thing that I kind of, again, came out of some of my frustrations with previous map drawing tools was like not actually being able to control the styling of the actual drawing tools. So I knew I wanted to have like really like deep control over the styling of whatever was being rendered to the screen, basically. And the last thing was like this idea of, and this kind of comes to the first point as well, is like low coupling. And what I mean by like low coupling is like things shouldn't be super tied together. Like you should be able to replace elements of it and things just continue to work as long as they adhere to the same interfaces. So the last point allows for the first point, which is just as long as everything is like kind of strongly decoupled, then you should be able to write, for example, like an adapter that works for like any mapping library. And likewise, like you should be able to change the mapping library and nothing else should really change, because the way that it's structured just means that the rest of the code just runs as normal, and all that's changing is like how it's being rendered, as opposed to like how it gets stored or like how, you know, the internals of the actual library work. So yeah, I kind of stuck with the tools that I was confident in and were familiar with. So the whole library is just written in TypeScript, like plain TypeScript, and tested with Jest. I know that testing was going to be like an important aspect. I feel like if you think some of the presenters earlier were touching on this idea of like, if you don't have good testing early, then it generally is harder to do that like later on. If you have like good testing strategies and good approaching to ensuring that your software actually does what you think it does up front, it's a lot easier than trying to like retrofit it in like 2 or 3 years time. So yeah, it was very, not necessarily like test driven development, but just ensuring that there was like a decent level of testing on kind of anything that I was writing. And then kind of addressing the main focal point of, I guess, one of the selling points of Terra Draw is this idea of like, how do you make it like cross library, right? Because the internals of all of those mapping libraries are really different. Like the way that Leaflet works is really actually, you know, like the internals of that are very different to like open layers, and very different to like a proprietary software like Google Maps, where you can't even see what's going on, right? Like you just, all that code is closed source. So like how do you have any clue? And it basically just comes down to like, ultimately, like to a device, there are actually quite a finite number of ways that you can interact with a map, right? You can click, you can maybe use a pointer like a touch device, or you can use a keyboard. So the actual interfaces in are quite finite and limited. So which actually is really helpful, because all you need to be able to do is write a little bit of code that says a click that happens in Leaflet or a click that happens in Google Maps or whatever. Like that's quite a thin piece of the actual architecture. So you don't need to, as long as you can account for those events. So on click, on key press, on, you know, like pointer down, it's actually not super complicated to just make that work across any different library. And that kind of works through this idea of like adapters. And an adapter has like an interface, so it has like a series of methods and properties that it needs to have like fulfilled in order for it to work. And the ones that are just like super important are project and unproject, because that basically allows you to go through the screen space to like a lat long. And as long as you can make that translation, a lot of the like underpinning logic is literally identical. So that's how you end up with this ability to be able to write cross-library software, right? It's just having this very small set of interfaces, small set of like functions that you can fulfill, and you do this via like an adapter. So at the moment, I've got adapters there are adapters written for Google Maps, Leaflet, Mapbox, GLJS. There are some more kind of in the works, which I'll come on to a little bit later. But yeah, in theory, there could be, you know, the idea is it's designed so that even if a new map library came along tomorrow, like I was saying, as long as you can kind of fulfill that interface, then it should like just work is the idea. And yeah, just to illustrate that like a little bit more, it's like this concept where you just have the browser, you have an adapter, and you just pick the adapter that you want. So if you're using Leaflet, you just use the Leaflet adapter, and then everything else that just happens behind the scenes is you don't really actually need to care about it too much. One of the cool things is like the modes. So I've designed the modes to be quite like extendable. So you could, these are like some of the built-in modes. So things that you might expect, like points, lines, polygons, a select mode. So you can go and select things and move it and all this kind of stuff. And there's also like a circle mode and a freehand drawing polygon mode. But again, with this idea of it being like very low coupling, is like you should just be able to, if you wanted to write your own mode, then that should be relatively straightforward, and it should just work with like once you've written the mode, it will work with Mapbox, Leaflet, or Google, or like whatever other adapter there is available, right? So the idea is like everything can work with everything, and you shouldn't have to worry about it, like how the internals of that works too much. So I kind of want to show you what this kind of looks like. I'm hoping, yeah, again, apologies as the aspect ratio is a bit low and it's not huge, but hopefully you can see. So on the left here, we have Leaflet. In the middle, we have Mapbox Draw. And on the right-hand side, we have Google Maps. You can see that like the way that you interact and the way in which it renders should just be identical. So it's kind of like you get this uniform look and feel across all the different mapping libraries. And the way in which it behaves should also just be uniform as well. So yeah, that's the kind of drawing element. The other thing I was saying earlier about that styling is like, it should be easy to just style whatever it is that you're trying to like render to the screen, and that shouldn't be like a big headache. So I've got this like fun little demo here where it's basically like as I move the mouse, it's updating the color of all of the circles in each one of the drawing libraries, and basically changing the color of it as the mouse moves. So it should also be very easy to just update the styling like on the fly as well. So you know, you might have the example where somebody, when they select something, you want to change the color of the polygon that they've selected, right? And that shouldn't be like a super complex thing to do. That should be easy, right? And then lastly, I just want to demonstrate like selecting. So this is the select mode. You can select things. You can move the coordinates. You can insert new coordinates. You can rotate. You can also scale via sort of like key bindings. And yeah, so it should just be, and this is kind of taking a lot of influence from like other map drawing libraries. So a lot of this comes from things like Mapbox.gl and Mapbox.gl, JS Draw, and other, you know, some of the other libraries that I talked at the beginning. Kind of one of the fun things about it was that like could pick and choose which of the experience, like the user experiences I thought worked the best, because when you're just looking at all of them, you can be like, well, this one is like, I think this one's rubbish and this one's great, so I'm just going to implement that one, right? But in theory as well, because it's all like extendable, you could write your own like select mode and you could make it behave like however you want, right? So it's all extendable and changeable, and you could just implement your own, like I say, your own select mode that works in some weird, wacky way that is specific for your project. And I'm hoping I can now change the slide. So yeah, next steps. So I've kind of been working on this for like, I guess, probably 4 months. And I kind of felt like I was getting to this point of like, there's this like story that kind of haunts me about this game called like Duke Nukem Forever, which holds the world record for being the game with the longest development time in history. It's like 14 years or something like ludicrous. And it was just like, you know, and then it eventually came out and it was just a big flop anyway, and like nobody really cared about it. So I was just like really conscious of that. And then when the opportunity came to speak at this conference, I was like, that's quite a good impetus to like get something like out the door and start thinking about like, actually, how do I get people using this? So yeah, I just wanted to say that like it's now the alpha version is now available. You could go and use this like today. If you are familiar with npm, it's a node package manager. You can just go and install this in like one of your local projects and play around with it. It's obviously, well, it is an alpha, so just bear that in mind. Like it might change quite rapidly. So I'm just trying to, if you're just interested in trying it and getting a feel for it, yeah, please feel free to go and have a play with that today. And I also published the website yesterday, so there's now a website for it as well, so it's like official. Yeah, and so as Nick alluded to at the beginning of the day, I've been really fortunate to receive some funding to help, pay for some of the development work that's been going on. And as part of that, I'm looking at building a open layers adapter and also map Libra adapter as well. So if you're familiar with those libraries, it should be available to work with those libraries as well. And yeah, so potentially in the future, maybe looking at like things like maybe offering like commercial support contracts or like professional services or other kind of like value add things on top of the actual library. Obviously the library itself will stay like open source, but maybe offering things like services on top. So if you're interested in helping, I've got I think a scheduled tweet that's going to go off in about 5 minutes. If you're on Twitter, I would very much appreciate a retweet, but obviously don't feel obliged if you're not going to want to. Or start it on GitHub, that would be great. It's just my name. My Twitter handle on GitHub is the same. Sorry, my handle on Twitter is the same as my handle on GitHub. So you should be able to find the project through there, and then just / Terra Draw. And the last thing is obviously just it'd be great to get people just trying it out and using it and just seeing. I'm just really intrigued to see what people think. And yeah, any feedback, feel free to you can raise a GitHub issue, or you can message me on social media or via email. Or if you know people that might potentially be interested in this project or like have a really good use case for this, I'd be really interested in speaking to people about that. That's me. I think that's thanks.
Got one question off YouTube.
Perfect.
It says, are you open to people writing adapters for other libraries?
Yeah, if they want to. I mean, the only thing is that I agreed as part of the OSGeo support to write the adapters for open layers and Map Libra. So if there are other, I mean, the only other ones I can think of are like Apple Maps Kit or like Esri, ArcGIS, JavaScript API. Maybe there's some others that I'm not like super familiar with. Maybe it would work with Cesium. I think because it's 3D, some of the concepts start to maybe like fall apart. I'd have to test it to be sure.
Okay. Got one more. How much native open layers draw capability will you use, and how much will be in Terra Draw?
So yeah, the whole premise, I guess. The answer is that it wouldn't use any of the native open layers drawing utilities, because all of the code is kind of like the only thing it would use is like the event handlers basically, and then that just pipes whatever the event is, normalizes it, and then sends it to Terra Draw. So there's no real, I guess the answer is that there's no real need to use any of the open layers drawing stuff, because it's all handled by Terra Draw basically.
I was pretty much going to ask the same question that we just asked, but I can kind of extend it a bit. So OpenLayers has some quite, especially the newest release of OpenLayers, it's got some quite nice like snapping and tracing tools. So presumably, if you did implement something like that, you'd want to implement it across all of your adapters. Is that right? Like you plan to have them all work exactly the same always, no special features for one.
Yeah. So there is snapping actually already as like a option in the like polygon mode as an example. I should have put a demo in the thing because it's quite cool. But so essentially the cool thing about that is that once you implement snapping, it will just work across, in theory, leaflet, Google
You
Maps.
integrate it on the mode rather than the adapter. So
It- It's at the mode level, so it's not like you don't. Yeah, I try and delegate as much actual logic and behavior in deeper, like further down. So the actual adapters are very thin. Like they basically only proxy events from the user to Terra Draw. Yeah. Cool.
Any more questions? Yeah, for a question. Are there plans to submit it into the OSGeo incubation program?
Yeah, it's an interesting one. Like, I don't know. In honesty, I don't know enough about the program to say like if that would be a good fit or not. When I did look at it, I think they have quite a lot of guidelines about like how they expect or how the project should be structured and run and this kind of stuff. So yeah, not fundamentally against it, but I'd have to understand more about like what that actually tangibly means, if that makes sense. But it is it's obviously a good initiative and might be a good way to kind of get more more opportunity to like recognition and kind of maybe more visibility to users and things like this. So yeah, not against it, but I just need to understand it more. Cool. Thanks. Do you want me to just unplug everything? Yeah.